I got my PhD in early Christianity, focusing on something called late antiquity, but no one can really decide when late antiquity begins and when it ends. I personally would say it stretches from the year 250 to around the year 650. Some would say the end of antiquity is around 700 or 750, but even at that earlier date, 650, we are solidly after the rise of Islam. But my graduate training didn't require any expertise at all on early Islam. I often find myself treating early Islam as somehow outside my field of the late Roman Empire, even though Islam emerged in close parallel with the late Roman world, drawing on many of the same cultural, religious, and intellectual traditions. So today I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, a scholar of Islamic studies at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on the Quran, the origins of Islam, and Muslim-Christian relations. And what makes his work especially compelling is how he bridges the study of early Islam with biblical scholarship. In our interview, we specifically talk about how the Quran depicts Jesus, and how Muslim and Christian traditions both overlap and diverge in understanding him. If you want to learn more from Dr. Reynolds, you can check out his YouTube channel or his free online course, Sacred Texts and Dialogue, Exploring the Bible and the Quran. Links to both of them are in the comments below. And without further ado, here's Dr. Reynolds. So I study early Christianity, and obviously the main person in Christianity is Jesus. And so when we think about Jesus as a figure, as a religious figure, we think of Christianity. And if you're like the astute academic type, you're like, okay, we'll talk about Judaism as well because he was a Jew during the second temple period. But Jesus as a religious figure in Islam is also a thing, but that just doesn't seem to come up as often, at least in the field of early Christian studies. We just don't talk about early Islam and how Jesus figured into the Quran, and I would just be really curious to talk about Jesus as a figure in Islam.
Absolutely. Jesus is not only a central figure in the Quran, he's also a contentious figure. The Quran, makes its own claims about Jesus in a sophisticated way. So it sort of engages with Christian ways of understanding Jesus, and possibly sort of reshapes or maybe thoughtfully redescribes principal or central elements of the Christian story about Jesus, famously the crucifixion. And the classic Islamic teaching is Jesus was not crucified at all. So not only did he not rise from the dead, he didn't even die. And so, it's difficult then, from an academic perspective, to sort of be attentive both to simply the central place Jesus has in the Quranic view and the Islamic view of God's relationship to humanity, but then also be attentive to sort of the contention around Jesus in the Quran.
So let's take it piecemeal then. So immediately I'm going to show how I do not know Arabic very well, because I did a whole video on this topic and I kind of astutely avoided saying the Quranic name of Jesus because I can't do the Ain. So walk us through, in Hebrew and Aramaic, his name was Yeshua or something along those lines.
Right.
In the Quran, it is not Yeshua.
His name is Isa, and the name is sort of a great place to start in a conversation about Jesus in the Quran, because it's a real mystery. Now, to those sort of habituated to English or other non-Semitic languages, the Semitic name, or the common Semitic name for Jesus, which is preserved in Arabic Christian tradition, which is Yeshua, it might sound like it's just a different version of what the Quran has, which is Isa. So we kind of hear like an S sound in there, in that Ain sound, but in fact, they seem to be totally different names. So on the first version, sort of the typical Semitic version, that famous consonant Ain is at the end. In the Quranic version, it's at the beginning. It's a real mystery. There's been a million different arguments about why the Quran uses a distinctive name for Jesus. Ranging from maybe the Quran was employing some form of the name of Esau, the brother of Jacob, familiar from the book of Genesis, and it perhaps sort of, responding to or absorbing Jewish anti-Christian language, to most recently, one of the great scholars of Arabian epigraphy, Ahmed Jalad of Ohio State, has argued that there is a precedent for the name Isa used by the Quran for Jesus and an inscription, a pre-Islamic Arabic language inscription. And so maybe there is an ancient, particularly Arabian way of referring to Jesus. I could say more about that. I don't want to get too much in the weeds right away. But in a way, I think the difference in the name, so in Arabic, Yeshua, in the Arabic Christian discourse, and Isa in the Quran and Islamic tradition, that difference is at least as useful as a sort of foundation for teaching about the distinctive portrait of Jesus in the Quran.
Mm. Yeah, so speaking of the distinctive portrait of Jesus in the Quran, let's talk about his biography. What biographical details come up in the Quranic narrative? Because, we're very familiar, at least in my field, with the gospel stories. You have Jesus's mother Mary. He has siblings. He has disciples. He does miracles. He travels around the Galilee region and then eventually ends up in Jerusalem where he's crucified. You've already alluded to the notion that he was not crucified in Islamic tradition. So what does the biography of Jesus look like in the Quran?
There's not a lot about Jesus in the Quran, and that's really a key point and a point that's often missed. So if you kind of, wander around the internet and different social media, you'll usually see chat around the doctrinal differences between Christians and Muslims about Jesus. So, maybe the crucifixion point, but, above all, the Christian claim that he is Son of God and Savior, Lord and Savior. And then the Muslim response that, no, he wasn't Son of God. He didn't have a divine nature. He was a prophet like all of the other prophets. So that's what you usually run into, my kids on some social media, if they happen to have some religious content, they'll see something about this if it's a back and forth between Muslims and Christians. But a really sort of more fundamental point, which to me is illustrative also about the Quranic project around Jesus, is that there's very little about the life story of Jesus. So just to give maybe a few sort of indicators of what is actually there, there's a description of his nativity. So the Quran has 114 chapters. By tradition, it was proclaimed by a man named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, in the cities of Mecca and Medina, so what is now Saudi Arabia, between the years 610 and 632 CE. And so we have two versions of the birth of Jesus in chapter 3 and chapter 19. So in Arabic, the first chapter is called Al Imran, and the second chapter is named after Mary, so it's called Maryam by most conventions. So we have that. And then we have allusions to different miracles. None of the miracles are really described. They're sort of cited as maybe evidentiary proofs of his prophethood. Some of these miracles are familiar from the four Gospels in the Christian New Testament, healing the blind, even raising the dead. And then other miracles are known from other early Christian sources, such as creating a bird from clay and bringing it to life with his breath. So we have these allusions to miracles. And then we have some statements of Jesus, none of which correspond to anything he says in the New Testament. And most of those statements are contentious or polemical. So Jesus is employed to reprimand Christians for what they say about him. And then there's some sort of mysterious stuff, which we could get into, about the end of Jesus' life and possibly his role in the end times. Maybe the bigger thing to say is like, what's missing, which is, a Muslim might say, well, you don't have to put it that way. But, if you look at the content of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from the New Testament, there's almost nothing from those Gospels in the Quran. So, all of his travels in Galilee, Samaria, Bethany, Jericho, all of that, all of the long discourses, all of the contention around, the Sabbath or other elements of Jewish law, the bread of life, the multiplication miracle. It's just not there. So, on the one hand, he is a common figure between Quran and Bible. On the other hand, there's actually very, very little in common.
There's so much to unpack there. I've always been aware of the story of him turning the clay birds into living birds, because this is an echo of the infancy gospel of Thomas, which is an early Christian text where Jesus does exactly that, which I find absolutely fascinating, that apocryphal Christian text seems to be echoed in this Quranic story.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I remember, but you could correct me on this one, Andrew, that in the infancy gospel of Thomas, there's some question also of his possibly doing that on the Sabbath. That could be from another tradition, but also it's meant to point to somehow his creative power. I don't know much about sort of the theology or the Christology behind that text, but it clearly sort of replicates the creation of Adam in the Genesis account, where God creates Adam from clay and brings him to life through his breath. And so Jesus sort of manifests his divine power by doing something similar, again with dirt or with clay. The Quran actually, it's the only time that it uses the verb that's used in reference to Jesus' miracle, khalaqa in Arabic. It's the only time it uses it other than its principal use of that verb, which is for God's creation. And then sort of the key detail, and an interesting one also from the perspective of the history of Islam's emergence, is that the Quran adds, after mentioning this miracle, that Jesus did so, that is, created life, by the permission of God. Now, for Muslims today, they'll often bring this up and they'll say, listen, everything Jesus did was done by God's permission. None of his miracles, therefore, redound to any divine nature. From a historical point of view, however, that the Quran adds this for Jesus's miracle, which it does not do, for example, for Moses's miracles that are mentioned in the Quran, shows that there presumably was a sort of sectarian context that the Quran is engaging with. In other words, the Quran is probably aware that Christians in its time and place were bringing up this story of the bird to argue for Jesus' divinity, and sort of anticipating that this kind of story could be used as a Christian argument. It seeks to undermine that in advance by saying, and he did this with the permission of God.
Right. So admitting, sure, he has miraculous powers, but this does not signal any divine status.
Absolutely. Yes. And I mean, that's sort of the heart of the matter for the Quranic Jesus and the Quranic message about Jesus. It does not seek to really retell a new story about Jesus. It doesn't provide an alternative to the Christian Gospels. It means to make a point about Jesus and his nature as only a prophet, never refers to him as Son of God, and to advance a figure, Jesus, who predicts the coming of Muhammad, which is another intriguing element of his personality.
What does it mean for Jesus to be a prophet, as opposed to Lord and Savior in Christianity? So I'm curious by the status of prophethood. So he can do miracles, he can presage the coming of Muhammad, but it never reaches, obviously, the level of Christianity where he is, God incarnate. So what does the status of prophet mean?
Terrific. Yeah, terrific question. There's sort of, I think, two ways of answering that. One way is intimately linked with the Quranic argument about Muhammad. So maybe I'll circle back to that. But another way is to sort of take a step back and just sort of look at the Quranic doctrine on prophets generally. So I don't want to turn this into a lecture, but I mean, in brief, for the Quran, prophethood is the principal sort of articulation or manifestation of divine mercy. So the Quran sort of agrees with the Bible. Of course, the Bible in some ways is a library in addition to being a book, but sort of agrees with a major emphasis of much of the Bible, which is that, God is a God who cares about the world. It's not the God of, say, Aristotle, who's just kind of floating around there doing nothing, and seeks, sort of observes humans sort of doing the wrong thing, getting into trouble, and intervenes. And the biblical story of God's intervention has its own particular sort of fabric, its own particular details. The Quranic version of God's intervention is prophethood. So God remains transcendent and attentive to the ways in which humans are acting badly, forgetting things, sinning, all this sort of thing, including, by the way, paganism and idolatry, which is a particular sort of theme that's brought up in the Quran. God sends prophets to remind them. And the prophet usually has two roles. One is to communicate the words given to him by God. Prophets are always men in the Quran, by the way. Communicate the words given to him by God. And then the second is to sort of exemplify proper behavior. So the prophet is a spokesman and an exemplar. I could circle back and speak a little bit about how the figure of Jesus as prophet is connected to Muhammad, but I don't want to go on too long if you want to follow up with that, or should I go on?
Oh no, I think that would be important, because I guess I'm wondering, just like, what does Jesus accomplish for the Islamic tradition? Like, why if Jesus and Christianity, at least we could go deep into Christian theology, but like, what the point is, save humanity, take on the sins of the world, eventually redeem humanity and defeat Satan at the end of time. Like, there's kind of like a list of things that Jesus accomplishes in the Christian theological lens. And I'm just wondering, like, to say Jesus is a prophet and he's here, he comes to earth and he does some miracles. I'm just curious, like, what does he accomplish for Islam?
Terrific. So I think that too, there's two ways of answering it, because we can look just at sort of the Quran's interest in Jesus. But of course, Islamic doctrine, as with Christian doctrine, even though people might say, oh, it's scripture alone. In fact, it's not scripture alone. There are other elements that sort of enter into doctrine. So the way Muslim, sort of the theological masters of Islamic tradition would answer that question would actually be more robust in certain ways. So as for the Quran itself, Jesus comes in a line of prophets, but they all look suspiciously like Muhammad. It seems evident the Quran, like the key question, its key demand is that you accept both God and Muhammad. So, even this is reflected in the Islamic profession of faith, or Shahada. There's two parts to it. It's God and Muhammad. Many mosques will have Arabic calligraphy somewhere that will have Allah and Muhammad. And they explain, well, Muhammad is not God for us, it's not divine, but the testimony of faith that Muslims must accept is both God and Muhammad, and that reflects what the Quran does with the prophets. So I go into detail, but Abraham in the Quran, Noah in the Quran, other figures who are not in the Bible, they all look suspiciously like Muhammad, and Jesus does as well. So Jesus is meant to sort of maybe give a proof that, Muhammad, he's like the earlier prophets. And perhaps that proof is targeted particularly at Jews and Christians, the way of saying, listen, guys, you accept Abraham, Noah, Moses, and Jesus, you should accept Muhammad. They're all basically the same. Now, just on the second way of addressing the question very briefly, many Muslim thinkers would say, well, Jesus does play a particular role, and they would sort of tell a story of salvation history, which to me is not actually evident in the Quran itself, but there are other traditions in Islam that Muslim thinkers draw on to sort of tell this story. And according to the story, the three prophets, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, begin to sort of represent Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which is a little bit paradoxical, because a Muslim would say at the same time, they're all really Muslim prophets. Nevertheless, according to the story, and this story is told in part by the great novel, The Children of the Alley, by the Egyptian Naguib Mahfouz in the 20th century. But according to this story, Moses sort of represents the justice, even the vengeance of God, and the strictness of the law which God imposes on humanity. And Jesus represents sort of the gentleness and the merciful side of God. And then Muhammad, of course, is like the perfect combination of both of those elements. So that is one way of answering that question. What does Jesus accomplish? Well, a Muslim thinker might say, he actually does show us a certain element of God, his mercy and compassion.
In Islam, there's hadith, this wider collection of literature about Muhammad. And you mentioned there's not a ton of biographical detail about Jesus in the Quran. So I'm wondering, is there a penumbra, a larger body of literature about Jesus, if we can't call it hadith? I don't know what we would call it in early Christian studies. We might call it apocrypha or extra biblical texts. But I'd be curious to know what that looks like.
Yeah, really, really important point. And in fact, many of the assumptions that Muslims have today about Jesus are not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. And, just as you anticipate, they come from a separate body of literature. Hadith is, complicated term, maybe a little bit like Torah in the Jewish context, because it has different meanings. In its strictest sense, hadith are those traditions of things those traditions of things that Muhammad either said or did, which, since they are connected directly to Muhammad, who is the last prophet, have sort of legal value. They can establish norms for the community. But there's a broader sense of hadith, which is basically, any narrative. And so we do have these other narrations about Jesus that begin to appear in all sorts of different genres of Islamic literature, really beginning in the 9th century. So this is kind of the Abbasid period, and we continue to see new ones develop in the following centuries of the medieval period. There's a really great book called The Muslim Jesus, I think, someone might correct me if I get the title wrong, in the comments, by the Palestinian scholar Tarif Khalidi, in which he collects all of these Islamic Jesus narrations, and he calls those narrations, so not the material in Quran, but the other narrations, he calls them the Muslim gospel, which kind of complicates things, but it's also pretty useful because they actually have content. They actually tell a story or tell stories about Jesus. And, there are features in the Muslim gospel, to use Professor Khalidi's term, which are not found at all in the Quran. For example, the Quran never explicitly says that Jesus was celibate, that he never was married or had children. It's not explicit in the Quran. Muslims, as a rule, we could speak about this if you want to, but they don't consider the New Testament to be valid. But that feature of Jesus as a celibate, which is very unusual in Islam, and Muhammad said that marriage is half of religion. And so that feature is found in this Muslim gospel. Another element that's found in this Muslim gospel is sort of Jesus as ascetic. And I guess this kind of unfolds maybe naturally from the idea that Jesus was celibate. But he said that he fasted all the time. He had no house. He used a stone as a pillow, and many other traditions. And so this sort of new image of Jesus appears in the medieval period as a sort of proto-mystic, ascetic. And I sort of try to illustrate this with my students by showing them scenes of a movie about Jesus done in Iran around 2007. Nader Talibzadeh, I think, was the director of that movie. And, Jesus sort of kind of wandering through the wilderness is this long sort of shaggy hair. And then he speaks very kind of mystically. And that, that vision of Jesus in that movie by Nader Talibzadeh, that's from the Muslim gospel more than from the Quran.
And so we're getting a little bit of biographical details here. So an ascetic, wandering through the wilderness. You have already alluded to the traditions about his death or lack thereof in terms of the crucifixion. Like what does the end of the life of Jesus look like in the Islamic tradition?
Right. So in the 4th chapter of the Quran, which again has 114 chapters, more or less going from longer size to shorter size. So one of the longer surahs, chapter 4, which is named the chapter of the women, in Arabic, An-Nisa, verse 157, it very sort of enigmatically has the Israelites boast of having killed Jesus. It even has them call him Christ, or Al-Masih in Arabic, which is, again, a bit of an enigma. And then the Quran goes on to say, and now it's no longer the direct speech of the Israelites, but it's the narrator of the Quran, assumed to be the voice of God, but, or rather, and then there's two ways of reading the passive Arabic verb shubbiha. Either the whole affair was made to seem to them, that is the Israelites, that way, or Jesus was made to appear to them. And for the most part, Muslim scholars go with the second alternative. So, I mean, you really get into niceties of Arabic grammar. And your decision on the grammatical question has like these massive consequences for the stories you tell. I mean, this is true not only about Jesus in the Quran, but almost everything. So most of Islamic tradition goes for the reading which would have Jesus made to appear to the Israelites. And even from a very early stage in the exegesis or the commentaries, we find these stories in which God took Jesus up to heaven before he died, and then cast his likeness and presumably his voice, but that detail usually is not added, onto someone else. And in most of these stories, the Israelites, after this sort of dramatic transformation has taken place, that's when the Israelites kind of surround the house in which the apostles are staying. Very often, the detail is added to make the story work that there were 13 apostles, not 12, because Jesus goes to heaven, and then one of the 13 apostles is made to look like Jesus. So this means when the Israelites come to arrest Jesus, they find him with 12 apostles. So the math all works out. And, they take this man and they crucify him in place of Jesus. So many things could be said about it. I don't want to go on and bore you or your audience, but I mean, part of this story is sort of provoked by certain turns of phrase in the Quran, not only in that verse, but actually in a verse in Quran chapter 3, which I could explain. But it's often sort of said that this scenario would vindicate God's prophet. So, it's often said that, the Quran's view of prophets and God is the prophet never loses, the prophet always triumphs. The Christian story of a prophet, who suffers a humiliating death, just the Quran, it's not its style. And so necessarily it had to tell the end of Jesus' life in a different way.
I mean, I find that fascinating from the perspective of early Christian studies, because you have this rich body of early Christian literature that casts Jesus as, this is the whole docetic perspective, docetic being Jesus seemingly being there, but not really being there in the flesh. And depending on the text, sometimes he's more of an apparition, sometimes he's kind of shape-shifting, or he appears human, but he's not really there. So the whole concept of Jesus being, taken away and then another person there appearing like him kind of falls in line with what some Christians would have said about Jesus too, maybe a few centuries later. The Quran is quite late in this for docetic Christian texts, which are much second or third century CE usually.
Right. I mean, I think that's sort of the key question. Earlier generations of scholars of the Quran often would call on, this sort of Gnostic, docetic movement in the early church, kind of comb through the heresiographies and then make the argument that, maybe a few of these guys were left in Arabia sort of unseen and somehow influenced Muhammad. But it's really hard to sort of, paint a picture that fills in the gap of a few centuries and makes a convincing or at least a compelling case for that. I mean, it should be said that the Quran does, even if we set aside the idea that the Quran couldn't countenance a prophet who seems to lose, even if we set that aside because, I think that could be questioned in different ways. The Quran does sort of accomplish two things with this very ambiguous verse in Quran chapter 4, verse 157. On the one hand, it does seem to undermine Christian language around the cross and salvation. And, it's up in the air. I'm debated. I have a very strong view on that debate. There's a debate over how many Christians were around in the place where Muhammad was preaching. But let's say they were around, then the prophet and the early community would have been aware of Christian veneration of the cross, Christian language about the cross, even in presumably, Christian hymns, other sorts of homilies in sermons that were being preached. So that's one thing it does. And then something else it does, and possibly this is even more important to the Quran, which is it also emphasizes strongly rhetoric around the Israelites as prophet killers. There's a lot that could be said here, but a number of places it speaks, including just a few verses previous to this verse 157. I think it's in verse 155, but someone could correct me. It speaks of the Israelites as the killers of prophets, or those who kill the prophets. And so, that sort of, heightens the tension around the crucifixion, because the Israelites are then, in verse 157, made to boast about also killing Jesus. And so they're sort of accused, or maybe convicted of the crime in as much as they intended it. But, the Quran still has God sort of outwitting them in the end. So this, they didn't actually get one of the great prophets, Jesus.
Yeah, he successfully got away, as it were.
Exactly. Yes. So the Quran, it uses language of, and not only in the context of Jesus, but regularly, that, basically God has the back of the believers. It uses this nice Arabic expression that Allah, or God, is wali al-mu'mineen, so the ally of the believers. This is very, very strong in the Quran. It's sort of, peppered throughout the entire text, this presentation of God sort of having the back of Muhammad's community. And the stories of earlier prophets sort of illustrate ways in which God had their back. And so it's a sort of reassurance that, now this community too, God is with you, Allah is with you. He will defend you and support you, and even outwit, even in some verses, trick the enemies of the believers. I think there's very strong biblical sort of undercurrents to this. One might think immediately of the story of Exodus, for example, but that's a whole nother.
So you alluded earlier to Jesus may or may not playing a role in the end times, the eschatology of Islam. So in early Christianity, so in texts like the Book of Revelation, Jesus returns, as a conquering warrior figure who battles against Satan and Satan's armies. So is there any eschatological role for Jesus in Islamic theology?
Yeah, in the Quran, it's very ambiguous. There seem to be hints. Some people would find hints. Others would say, no, it's not, you're reading this the wrong way. But no, there is a verse in the Quran just after the crucifixion verse, so verse 159 of chapter 4, which begins, again, the grammar's pretty tough here, but it seems to say all of the people of the book will believe in him before either their death or his death. And the way Arabic works, it's just ambiguous. One way of reading that is it's indicating what will happen when Jesus returns, which is that, Jesus did not die the first time around because he was taken up to heaven, body and soul. So it's the verses to be read before his death. And then he'll come back in the end times and basically unify the world around Islam. And everyone will believe in Jesus as a Muslim prophet. And then there's another verse in Quran 43, Az-Zukhruf, which speaks of it or him being a sign of the hour. We just have the pronoun there, but if you look at the context, it could be read as Jesus being a sign for the hour, and the hour with a capital H is understood to mean, the end times, the last time. And so commentaries on that verse say, well, Jesus is a sign for the hour because he will come down from heaven. And once you sort of see him, by the way, it's usually said he'll come down to Damascus, intriguingly enough. Once you see him, and then he'll head for the Holy Land. But once you see him coming down from heaven in Damascus, you know that kind of the hour is at hand. So much, Andrew, that could be said about this because, I mean, eschatology is prominent in the Quran, plus, in chatter, scholarly chatter, among contemporary scholars, there's a lot of debate over possibly eschatological or apocalyptic elements in the early Islamic community, as there is in Christian studies as well. So it's a really major question. The place of Jesus, it's sort of a problem in Islamic theology because it's really important that Muhammad be the last prophet.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was gonna say. Like, this kind of gives Jesus a second chance, as it were, a second whack at it to be prophet.
Muhammad died. He died in 632. He's buried in a tomb in the city of Medina, but Jesus didn't die yet. He's alive right now, body and soul in heaven, and he will finish his life. And actually, a lot of narrations speak of Jesus when he comes back. Then he will get married, and live as most Muslims do, live out his life, and then die and be buried in a tomb next to Muhammad in Medina.
Hmm. That's so interesting. Like, and him coming back as a prophet to unify people, it's still not as apocalyptic as Christian eschatology, where like the end of the world. Well, maybe not. But
I mean, just to complete the story, because I left stuff out. It's pretty violent as well.
okay.
So he comes back, as you had mentioned in the book of Revelation, with this, exacting vengeance for the blood of the martyrs and other things like that the author's worried about. So yeah, Jesus comes back, and there is an antichrist figure named Ad-Dajjal, who's not mentioned in the Quran. He's coming from other traditions. And Jesus will confront him. There'll be big battles. Different people will be slaughtered. Crosses will be broken. Pigs will be killed. So there's that kind of stuff too.
All right. So still end time battle sort of theme.
What's missing is, Jesus is not a king of the universe who will be enthroned in some way, or there's no heavenly Jerusalem coming down. So, in fact, there's another sort of messianic figure who comes in the end times called the Mahdi, Mahdi in most English spellings. And Jesus will sort of do his thing, defeat the Antichrist, and then, according to most narrations, pass over the rule to this other figure who's named the Mahdi, who will rule over the world. So not Jesus, but this other figure named the Mahdi will rule over the world in its sort of final period, maybe, I don't know, analogous. I don't know if there's any real connection, analogous to the ideas of millenarianism where Jesus rules for 1,000 years and that kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with the Dune movies being such a big hit, the Mahdi is kind of a has become common parlance, and I've always found it. Yeah, you definitely should. You definitely should. I mean, the next one's coming out next year, I think, and it's called Dune Messiah, so it's even more apocalyptic, as it were. But I've always found that interesting, to having like two figures at the end of time, where you have Jesus, then him, passing the football, as it were, to the Mahdi. Like that is interesting.
Yeah, Sam, 100%. Mahdi, it's a name that means the one basically who's rightly guided. There are some traditions which say, they're minority traditions, that Jesus is the Mahdi, but they're minority traditions. This has a whole nother sort of articulation in Shiite tradition, which, may or may not be interesting, because it's actually connected with a story of, the righteous leaders in Shiism known as imams. The last one disappears in the late 9th century, I believe. And, so this Mahdi figure is then understood to be the reappearance of this last Shiite imam. And then there's Sunni Shiite stuff that comes up there as well.
So I'd be curious about, I don't know how much you study contemporary Islam, but how is Jesus conceptualized today, or how does he factor into your average Muslim's uh, you know, life? Like, here in the 21st century, like, is he a kind of a minor figure that just kind of comes up in quirky theological questions, debates, or whatever, or is there a bigger role being played here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, terrific question. And I could sort of make some comments about that, from an out as a non-Muslim, as an outside from an outside perspective. But in some ways, I think it's a question that's best answered by a Muslim believer because as the way theology and spirituality is central to Christianity is very similar in Islam, and so one Muslim, drawing on their own spiritual or theological resources, may understand Jesus in one way, another Muslim in a second way, etc. But I mean, there are some important observations that can be made. Actually really interesting to me. It's not really my thing. So I study early Islam principally, but I'm very interested and I read a lot and also watch Muslim preachers a lot on YouTube. So, when Jesus comes up both in literature, in modern Islamic literature, I know mostly the Arabic Islamic literature, but then also in sort of sermons and preaching or, TikTok, it's usually in an apologetic context. So, I mean, that's how you usually run across the Muslim Jesus in the contemporary period. So, and there's all sorts of reasons about this. I mean, we shouldn't forget that there was a massive wave of Christian missionaries in the Islamic world, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that provoked, very dynamic response from Muslim apologists. But that hasn't slowed down at all in the 21st century. So Jesus is often seen, by Muslim apologists as sort of a good first step to do dawah, as it's called, basically Muslim evangelism, speak about why, for example, according to them, the Muslim view of Jesus is more reasonable, or, we love Jesus too. So you see people with t-shirts, I love Jesus because I'm Muslim, that kind of thing. And there is a little bit, in my humble opinion, of sort of separation between the rhetoric that's used by apologists, dawah folks, around Jesus and the actual place that Jesus has in the norms for Islamic teaching and practice, because in the end, Islamic teaching is that it's Muhammad's articulation of the Sharia is the only one that matters. Muslims, and the great Turkish scholar Mustafa Ekyol has pointed this out in his writings, Muslims actually do not turn to Jesus. They certainly don't turn to the Gospels, which they generally see as corrupt, to think about, how they should do their religion or how they should think about God. They turn to Muhammad and maybe Muhammad's companions. So there's that tension there. And I'll just add one further thing is that, the figure of Jesus also becomes, for certain Muslims, sort of an object of fascination to express other teachings. And I alluded earlier to the novel Children of the Alley by Naguib Mahfouz. It's not the only one. There are others I could speak about that are interesting in this regard, but it's a nice example because it's an allegory set in Cairo. In the chapter dedicated to Jesus, Naguib Mahfouz was a believing Muslim, even though he's accused of heresy and actually attacked towards the end of his life. But he tells the story of this figure, is named Rifa in the novel, who clearly represents Jesus, but he becomes fascinated, Muslim his whole life, never converted to Christianity, and becomes fascinated with Jesus as a way of sort of articulating a new dimension of Islam that might be missed otherwise, which is, solidarity with the poor, solidarity with the outcasts, standing up to the abuse of power. So outside of apologetics, I mean, I think it's important to add, it's not only apologetics. There are very, creative, intriguing ways in which Muslims engage with Jesus.
Well, Dr. Reynolds, thank you so much for joining us. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion.
It was an honor and a pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Again, if you want to learn more from Dr. Reynolds, you can check out his YouTube channel here, or you can check out his recent free online course, Sacred Texts and Dialogue. Links to both of them are in the comments below. Thanks everyone.